Good thing I had the helmet on. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Hat Historian. In this video, I'll be talking about a hat that every cyclist is recommended to wear when riding their bike. The bicycle helmet. A lightweight helmet, often with many venting openings, the bicycle helmet has become a very important element of cycling safety, protecting the wearer during falls or collisions, but despite the clear advantages of wearing it, it has only relatively recently been adopted widely by riders. The bicycle first appeared in the 19th century. Its precursor, the Dresienne, whose creation is attributed to Carl von Drais, was simply a seat on a frame between two wheels, without pedals, that was propelled by running, thence the German term Laufmaschine, or running machine. Later, French and Scottish inventors successively developed various pedal-driven models called velocipedes, which eventually evolved into the iconic penny farthing, so named because the two mismatched wheels resembled the two coins side by side. The disproportionately large front wheel was there to make pedaling easier. As the pedals themselves were affixed to it, it provided larger distribution of force. However, it also made the bicycle very tall, with a high and forward center of gravity, and the slightest impediment, say a dislodged cobblestone, could cause the rider to fly forward, oftentimes head first, over the handlebars, with a high likelihood of great injury. It is only in 1885 that the Rover Company developed its safety bicycle, which is very similar to the modern version, with its two lower same-size wheel and a seat situated in the middle. Despite the potential for taking a header off one of these tall bikes, as the expression so descriptively states, few people wore any kind of protection. Workmen who began adopting bicycles as a way to go to their jobs would wear their flat caps or berets. Gentlemen who adopted the practice as a hobby would wear the same headgear as when riding horses, namely stiffened top hats or bowlers, which, while better than nothing, would not really do much more than avoid a few scrapes or a bump on the head. The first places to adopt, if tentatively, some sort of head protection were the cycling clubs that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These groups were very popular after the 1880s as a way to enjoy the less encumbered roads of the pre-automobile era with like-minded friends. These groups began noticing that head injuries from falls could lead to serious complications, and started advocating for some sort of protection. The first attempts were with pith helmets, similar to the ones worn in the colonies that I have talked about in another video. Made with somewhat spongy vegetable fibers or cork, with a little space between the head and the shell, they would break apart, taking some of the energy of the fall, and protect the head of the unlucky rider. They had the advantage of being fairly lightweight and allowed for good air circulation, the reason they were worn in tropical climates in the first place, but only provided superficial protection. Furthermore, they were only worn by a small fraction of cyclists, usually enthusiasts, but not by the general population. As cycling only grew in the early 20th century, a natural development was that of bicycle racing. Competitions began to appear around the world, the most famous of which, the Tour de France, being founded in 1903. Very few professional racers, admittedly, could be convinced to wear a helmet, for a variety of reasons, but the increased amount of people partaking in the sport did lead to new inventions. One of them was a leather helmet, derived from models developed for motorcycles, which consisted of a leather skull cap surrounded by leather tubes filled with padding. It was sturdier than the pith helmet, offering better protection from abrasions and superior cushioning, though it did have the problem of being heavier and less breathable. This is a problem that has always been at the heart of bicycle helmet design. Cycling, especially on the professional level, is a very aerobic and physical discipline, which leads to great exertion and heat that needs to be evacuated, particularly through the head. Furthermore, in racing, every gram counts, and an uncomfortable helmet can be a hindrance. Therefore, light caps were long preferred despite the risk of injury, and even the helmets that were worn were designed to be as lightweight as possible. With these considerations in mind, these early leather skull caps were quickly replaced by a new design, which kept the leather tube around the head, but replaced the top with more tubes, usually filled with wool or cotton fibers, separated with empty space for ventilation, earning it the nickname hairnet helmet. These helmets tended to only be worn by professional riders, and even then by a select few. Beyond any consideration of comfort and overheating, they also did look a little strange, and the proud cyclist, not wanting to look ridiculous, tended to eschew this odd piece of headgear out of simple pride. I should note that I focus mostly on male cyclists, but women have a long history of bicycle riding too, with it giving them a newfound sense of freedom in a repressive society, despite late 19th century fears that it would corrupt the virtue and lead to wanton behavior. It was ridiculous, that's all I'll say on the matter. The wearing of helmets by women cyclists was even rarer, as elaborate hairstyles or hats of the late 19th and early 20th centuries would not allow for them, and considerations of safety took just as much of a backseat compared to style as for men. This rarity of helmet wearing continued through World War II. One early proponent amongst professionals was Jean Robic, a Breton cyclist, who had a serious fall during the 1946 Paris-Roubaix race. After this, he took to wearing a helmet during every subsequent competition, which was seen as surprising and unusual by commentators of the time, and earned him the nickname Tête de Cuir, or Leatherhead, showing that popular opinion was still not convinced of their necessity. Helmets remained roughly the same, with the hairnet design being the most universal with the rare wearers, until the 1970s. In the United States, bicycles experienced a boom in popularity in the early decade, and this caused a fresh look into safety concerns. Studied, notably by the Snell Group, showed that existing helmet designs were thoroughly inadequate and made new recommendations for standards to be toughened. Around this time, technological breakthroughs in foam materials allowed for lighter, more cushioning helmets. The Bell Corporation, which had designed many motorcycle and auto racing helmets, began to apply this technology to develop a new cycling helmet, and in 1975 came out with the Bell Biker, which, with its hard polycarbonate plastic shell over foam interior, can be considered the first modern bicycle helmet. The helmet spread first in America, but it was still slow to gain traction. Not until the mid-1980s were any firm standards put in place, with the American National Standards Institute codifying them in 1984. As American cyclists appeared in European races, the practice of wearing a helmet was slowly introduced, though Europeans were very slow to adopt it. Part of the problem was the profile and ventilation, which were deemed insufficient for competitive wear. However, racers soon started working in combination with scientists and the manufacturers to develop better performing teardrop-shaped helmets. Steve Hegg in the US and Francesco Moser in Italy were both precursors of such helmets. New foam liners were developed that provided superior cushioning, allowing for bigger vents to be installed, with these taking off in the early 1990s. The general public was still very reticent, and even professionals were loath to adopt this piece of equipment. An attempt to mandate its wear by the Union Cycliste Internationale, the International Cycling Union, in 1991 led to a strike by racers in that year's Tour de France, which made some countries abandon the rule. Nonetheless, public awareness was slowly growing as to their utility, and while the shape and design of the helmets changed little, new materials and suspension systems made them more comfortable and easier to adjust, thereby encouraging their use. So I've been mentioning that, like most safety gear, it's a good idea to wear one. But what are the potential risks of not doing so? Well, I'm a historian, so head injuries are not my expertise. I do, however, have a good friend who knows a lot about such things. To tell you more about risks and injuries, here is my friend Alainna Brown.
Hi, my name is Alainna Brown, and I'm an MD PhD student who is also a lifelong cyclist. I've also worked as an EMT and have a background as a neuroscientist, so I'm always really excited to talk with folks about injury prevention, especially when it comes to things like wearing your helmets. A brief note here at the top, my contribution to this video and this video series does not constitute medical advice, and I'm sharing the information here as a general educational resource. Bike helmets protect our heads from traumatic injuries in the event that we fall off of our bikes or otherwise collide with something. Why protect your head? Well, other than we like to keep our brainiums in our craniums, your skull is essentially a rigid box that contains a variety of important things. For our purposes here, those things include the brain and the blood that our heart pumps to the brain as well as to the rest of the body. In milder forms of what we call traumatic brain injury, like concussions, the brain won't sustain profound damage, but the impact might still alter your brain's ability to function normally. Those impacts can add up over the lifetime, and an extreme example of potential outcomes of that could be something like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which you may have heard about in the context of professional athletes in contact sports. In more severe cases, the brain might swell up or even bleed. You may also see seizures because of aberrations to the brain's electrical activity caused by that impact. Back to the swelling or bleeding, and I think I'll give a quick trigger warning here for maybe the next 30 seconds or so. Think about hitting your thumb with a hammer by accident or accidentally closing it in a door. Your thumb might swell up, or you could even develop a bruise because of the breakage of blood vessels inside your thumb. The same thing essentially happens with the brain when you sustain a large enough impact to it. But the problem is that, again, the skull is a rigid box, so you can't expand outwards. The problem with that is that that pressure still will dissipate. That can cause things like downward pressure from your brain onto your brainstem, which is the region that connects your brain to your spinal cord and the rest of your body. The problem with that is that the brainstem is in charge of some really important functions, like breathing and regulating your breathing. So sometimes more intense head injuries can become life-threatening. Because you can't generally tell the nature of somebody's head injury just by looking at them, any blow to the head that's sufficient to cause things like altered consciousness, confusion, dizziness, passing out, blacking out, and so forth, warrants seeking immediate medical attention. Other things that could put you at risk for complications to a head injury include things like having a blood clotting disorder, being on blood thinners, or being prone to seizures. So how do helmets protect the head, now that we've established that it's absolutely something we do want to protect? Helmets absorb a portion of the force from a traumatic impact to the head so that your skull and everything inside it don't have to absorb that impact. Buckling up your helmet and making sure that your helmet fits well are excellent ways to make sure that your helmet can do its job correctly. One important thing to note is that you should never take a helmet off of somebody who's experienced a significant head injury unless cleared by somebody like a paramedic or other medical professional who's acting in that capacity at the time, not just a bystander. In fact, in the emergency room, we'll often see head imaging with helmets still on. Now, the reason, again, is that we don't always know what condition the skull and other potentially impacted anatomy may have sustained just by looking at a person. And in fact, in some cases, that helmet may be preventing an injury from worsening. So until docs can rule out potentially very severe injuries or life-threatening injuries, we do want to keep that helmet on. When and how should you wear a helmet? All the time when you're doing something that puts your head at risk. In terms of recreational things like riding your bike, it's important to wear a helmet whenever you do ride your bike or ride other things like scooters or, ride on a skateboard and so forth. In fact, I had a friend in medical school who diligently wore his helmet every day when he came to school on his unicycle. Wearing a helmet is like wearing a seatbelt. It's only going to prevent injury if you wear it. It's also very important to wear a helmet that's the correct size for you and make all the necessary adjustments inside the helmet if you have the option to do that, as well as buckling up the straps, making sure that the straps are nice and tight without cutting off things like blood supply. And a well-fitting helmet really is not going to slide around the head or fall off as you move around. One thing that I like to do is put mine on, make all the adjustments, buckle her up, and then flip my head upside down, give it a nice shake, and make sure that it doesn't slide around or move otherwise. It just becomes a part of my head, essentially. One final thing to note here is that any helmet that is involved in a significant impact is essentially done as a helmet. The reason for this is that you can't guarantee that it's structurally still intact enough to provide the same level of protection. While replacing helmets can be expensive, it's a really good investment because you and your brain are priceless. Finally, I always like to encourage everybody to take a basic cyclist safety course if available. And I'd like to thank Jean-Charles for the invitation to contribute to this video. I'll pass it back over to him here.
Thank you, Alainna. So, I'm sure that by now, most if not all of you are convinced that helmets are a good idea for all sports where head injury is a risk, and cycling in particular. Yet laws requiring them, such as is the case for motorcyclists, are actually pretty rare. Countries that were early in mandating them for all riders were Australia, where various states and territories adopted laws making them compulsory in the early 1990s, or New Zealand, which required them after 1994. Others include Argentina or Namibia. Some provinces of Canada or states of the US sometimes have local ordinances, and certain countries such as France require them for minors. But for the most part, they are only encouraged, and loosely at that. In the US, barely 1 out of every 5 cyclists say they wear a helmet. Even in competition, requires came surprisingly recently. Despite attempts that I mentioned earlier, pushback stopped any universal rules by the UCI. However, after the fatal fall of Kazakh cyclist Andrei Kivyliev on the Paris-Nice race in 2003, whose doctors said he would have likely survived if he had worn a helmet, the union decided to crack down. Nonetheless, the Tour de France, arguably the most famous cycling competition in the world, did not require helmets for all its sections until 2005. While the general shape of bicycle helmets has remained fairly the same for the last couple decades, new materials such as carbon fiber or newer plastics have been incorporated in a constant quest to make them lighter while retaining an adequate level of protection. Other models are a little more creative, though I personally am dubious about their efficacy, such as a model that inflates around the head right before impact, allowing it to be hidden in a collar. It might work, I don't know, but it sounds complex. Different models offering more protection also exist, such as for BMX or acrobatic biking, as opposed to the very lightweight racing models, and then intermediary ones for the casual rider. There are also debates as to whether or not they make a real difference, with some people arguing that they might create a sense of complacency or false security in the wearer, and that increased rates of use do not necessarily mean decreased injuries, pointing to the Netherlands as having low helmet use and low injury rates compared to Australia. However, the Netherlands also has many other safety measures such as dedicated lanes and high awareness, so bike safety is related to a whole variety of factors. Wearing one is in most places an individual choice, though it's never bad to put a little extra safety on your side, whatever it might do to your hairdo. With new models being developed all the time, they'll only get more comfortable and more effective, if not necessarily more stylish. So I hope once again that you found this video interesting and will join me again soon for another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you.